I should have known the moment I moved to Pinecrest Highlands that there would be trouble. But when you find 10 acres with a mountain view in Durango, Colorado for a reasonable price, you don't ask too many questions. The realtor had mentioned something about an HOA during the closing, but I was too busy thinking about the custom workshop I'd build and the view of the San Juan Mountains from my bedroom window to pay attention to the fine print. My name is Harrison Kimball, and I'm a metalworker by trade. At 42, I'd finally saved enough to build my dream house on a piece of land that actually felt like home. The property sat on the eastern edge of the development, right where the foothills started their climb toward the mountains. Beautiful in summer, but I knew from growing up in Montana that eastern-facing properties in mountain country had one major issue during winter: snow drifts. The first year, I was too busy with construction to worry much about it. My house was a simple 2-story design with a metal roof, built to handle heavy snow loads. I moved in during July, and by September I had my workshop up and running. That's when I met Linda Pemberton. She showed up on a Tuesday afternoon in a white Mercedes SUV that probably cost more than my entire property. I was outside welding a custom gate for my driveway when she pulled up, her face already twisted into that particular expression I'd come to recognize over the years. The universal look of someone who was about to make my life difficult. "Excuse me," she called out, not bothering to wait for me to finish my weld or even turn off my equipment. "Excuse me, sir." I shut off the torch and lifted my helmet. "Can I help you?" "I'm Linda Pemberton, president of the Pinecrest Highlands Homeowners Association." She said it like she was announcing herself as the Queen of England. "I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood and remind you of some of our community standards." I wiped my hands on my work pants and walked over. Up close, Linda was probably in her late 40s, with that overly processed blonde hair and the kind of artificial tan you get from a salon. Her whole outfit screamed money, from the designer sunglasses perched on her head to the shoes that had definitely never seen a dirt road. "Thanks for the welcome," I said, trying to keep things friendly. "What standards are we talking about?" She pulled out a tablet and started scrolling through what looked like a massive document. "Well, first of all, that gate you're building needs to be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. All exterior structures, fences, and modifications require prior approval. It's a gate for my driveway, on my property, which is part of Pinecrest Highlands and therefore subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll need you to submit an application with detailed plans, materials specifications, and color samples. The committee meets once a month." I took a deep breath. "Okay, fine. What else?" "Your workshop needs to be painted to match approved community colors. That bare metal exterior is not acceptable, and you'll need to plant screening vegetation so it's not visible from the street. The workshop is 300 feet from the road. Nevertheless, it's visible, and our community prides itself on maintaining property values." She tapped her tablet again. "I'm sending you a copy of the full CC and Articus. Please review them carefully. We have very specific guidelines about everything from lawn maintenance to holiday decorations." That first meeting should have been a bigger warning sign. I submitted the paperwork for my gate, waited 2 months, and finally got approval after they made me change the design 3 times. The workshop paint battle took another 4 months and ended with me spending $3,000 on a custom color they approved called Mountain Sage, which looked exactly like the original gray I'd wanted. But I survived my first year, and when winter came, I finally understood why my property had been such a good deal. The wind in Durango comes down from the mountains with serious force, and my property sat at the perfect angle to catch it. That first winter, I watched as snow from the open fields to my east got picked up and deposited in massive drifts across my entire front yard. By January, I had a drift that was 8 feet tall blocking my driveway, and I was spending 2 hours every morning with a snowblower trying to keep up. My nearest neighbor, an older guy named Tom who'd lived in Pinecrest for 15 years, stopped by one day while I was fighting with a particularly stubborn drift. "You need a snow fence," he said, leaning on his truck. "This property used to have one, but the previous owner took it down when he moved." "A snow fence?" "Yeah, you put it up about 50 feet from whatever you're trying to protect. It disrupts the wind flow and makes the snow drop before it gets to your driveway and house. Old ranching trick." He gestured toward the open field. "You put one up along your property line there and you'll cut these drifts by 70, maybe 80%. That spring, I did my research. Snow fences are common in Colorado, especially in areas like mine. They're typically 4 feet tall, made of wood slats or plastic, and they work by creating a windbreak that forces snow to drop on the windward side instead of continuing to drift. The science was solid, and I found dozens of properties around Durango using them. I spent a weekend in May installing a 200-foot snow fence along my eastern property line. It was simple wooden construction, not particularly pretty, but functional. I placed it well within my property boundaries, making sure I wasn't encroaching on the open space beyond. 2 days later, Linda was back. "Mr. Kimball, what is that?" She stood next to her Mercedes, pointing at my snow fence like I'd installed a nuclear reactor. "Snow fence. Keeps the drifts off my property. It's hideous, and it's not approved. It's a farm structure on agricultural land." My property is zoned residential agricultural. I'd done my homework this time. I checked with the county. I don't need a permit. Linda's face turned an interesting shade of red. "You need HOA approval for any fence or structure. Any structure. It's not a fence, it's a snow-controlled device. It looks like a fence, therefore it requires approval." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. "This is a clear violation of the CC and RTCS. You'll be hearing from our attorney." I'd underestimated Linda's commitment to making my life hell. Within a week, I received a certified letter from the HOA's law firm, ordering me to remove the snow fence immediately or face fines of $100 per day. I called a lawyer of my own, a guy named Steve Morrison who handled property disputes. "Do I have a case?" I asked, sitting in his office in downtown Durango. Steve read through the HOA documents carefully. "Maybe. The CC and RTCS do require approval for fences and exterior structures, but there's some case law in Colorado about agricultural structures on residential agricultural property. The problem is, fighting this could cost you more in legal fees than just taking the fence down." "How much are we talking?" "If the HOA really digs in, could be 20–30,000, maybe more if it goes to court." I thought about it for a long moment. "And if I just take it down?" "Then you're back to dealing with the snow drifts, but at least you're not paying lawyers and fines." The math was brutal. I could be right and still lose everything I'd saved fighting a board of bored rich people with too much time and money. So in June, I took down the snow fence, stacked the materials in my workshop, and tried to forget about it. That summer was quiet. I focused on my metalwork, took on some commission pieces, and tried to avoid thinking about winter. Linda left me alone, probably satisfied with her victory. Then September arrived, and with it came the monthly HOA meeting. I'd never attended one before, but I decided it was time to at least see what I was dealing with. The meetings were held at Linda's house. A massive modern construction up on the ridge with panoramic views and probably 4,000 square feet of unnecessary space. About 20 people showed up, mostly women in their 40s and 50s, along with a handful of husbands who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Linda ran the meeting with an iron fist, going through architectural approvals, discussing a proposed playground for the community park, and debating the merits of various landscaping companies. When they opened the floor for new business, I raised my hand. "Yes, Mr. Kimball." Linda's voice could have frozen water. I wanted to discuss snow control measures for properties on the eastern edge of the development. My property, and I believe several others, experience severe drifting that makes the driveways impassable. I'd like to request approval for a snow fence installation. Silence fell across the room. Finally, a woman I didn't know spoke up. "Snow fences are ugly. We moved here for the views, not to look at farm equipment. It's a functional structure that serves a real purpose," I said. "Without it, I'm spending hours every day clearing drifts, and sometimes I can't even get my truck out." Linda tapped her pen on her notepad. "Mr. Kimball, this community has aesthetic standards. If we allowed everyone to put up whatever structures they claimed were functional, we'd look like a junkyard. The architectural committee has already reviewed your request and denied it." "I never submitted a request. You put up the fence without permission, which constituted an informal request." "The answer is no." I looked around the room, hoping for some support, but everyone avoided eye contact. These people didn't care about snow drifts. Their properties were on the western side of the development, sheltered by the ridge. They'd never dealt with what I was facing. "Is there any compromise?" I asked. "Could I install something that's more aesthetically pleasing but still functions as a wind break?" Linda smiled that cold smile again. "You could plant evergreen trees along your property line. That would be attractive and functional. Trees take years to grow tall enough to work, and they cost thousands of dollars. Then I suppose you'll need to save up. Request denied. Next item of business." I left that meeting understanding exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't about aesthetics or community standards. This was about control. Linda Pemberton got her kicks from telling people what they could and couldn't do on their own property, and my snow fence had challenged that authority. October arrived with the first real cold snap. I spent 2 weeks weatherproofing my house, servicing my snowblower, and generally preparing for what I knew was coming. Tom stopped by again, noticed the missing snow fence, and shook his head. "They made you take it down." Linda Pemberton made me take it down. "That woman." Tom sighed. "She's been a nightmare since she moved here 5 years ago. Used to be the HOA was pretty relaxed, just made sure people didn't let their properties turn into eyesores. Then Linda got elected president, and suddenly we had rules about everything. Why doesn't anyone vote her out?" "People tried last year. She controls the proxy votes from the investment properties, the vacation homes that are only occupied a few months a year. Out of 57 properties in Pinecrest, maybe 30 are full-time residents. Linda has proxy authority for 18 of the vacation homes. She can't be removed." That was a depressing piece of information. "So she's president for life, unless someone buys up enough properties to outvote her pretty much." The first snow came on November 8th, just 3 inches, nothing serious, but enough to remind me what was ahead. The second storm hit on November 15th, dumping 14 inches over 2 days. The wind picked up on the second night, and by morning, I had a drift across my driveway that was 6 feet tall at its peak. I spent 4 hours with the snowblower clearing it. The snow was heavy and wet, and twice the machine clogged and I had to stop to clear the chute. By the time I finished, my back was screaming and my hands were numb despite heavy gloves. Linda drove past while I was finishing up. She slowed down, looked at me and the massive pile of snow I'd cleared and kept going without a word. That's when the idea started forming. I didn't plan it exactly. It just sort of crystallized in my mind as I stood there, exhausted and frustrated, watching her Mercedes disappear up the road toward her perfect house on the ridge. Linda and her friends had decided that their view was more important than my ability to access my own driveway. They'd used the HOA rules to force me to deal with a problem they'd never experienced. Fine. But there was nothing in those rules that said I had to clear snow that wasn't on my property. The way the wind worked, the snow that drifted across my land had to come from somewhere. It got picked up from the open field, traveled across my property, and then continued up the hill toward the houses on the ridge. My snow fence would have caught it and made it drop on my land. Without the fence, it just kept going. I called Tom that evening. "How bad are the drifts up on the ridge?" "Not too bad. Most of those properties have natural wind breaks from the slope and the trees." "Why?" "Just curious." The next storm came 5 days later. Another 16 inches, and this time the wind was even stronger. I did the math in my head. Without my snow fence, all that snow getting picked up from the field was going to blow straight across my property and continue up the hill. The question was where it would drop. I cleared my driveway again, but this time I did something different. I used my tractor to blade all the snow from my property line straight up toward the edge of my land, creating what was essentially a ramp. The wind would hit that ramp, lift the snow up and carry it forward. Basic physics. That night, the wind howled like a living thing. I stood at my bedroom window, watching snow devils dance across the field in the moonlight, watching the white clouds of powder get picked up and carried toward the ridge. By morning, I had my usual drift, but it wasn't as bad as before. The ramp had worked. I went about my clearing, taking my time, not particularly worried about it. Around 10 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Tom. "Harrison, did you see the drifts up on the ridge?" "No, why? They're massive. I've never seen anything like it." "Linda's house has a drift against the garage that must be 10 feet tall. Same with the Hendersons and the Kramers. Half the houses up there are buried." I tried to keep my voice neutral. "That's terrible. The weird thing is, it's just the houses on the north side of the ridge. The ones that face your direction. Everyone else is fine. Wind does strange things in the mountains." After Tom hung up, I got in my truck and drove up to the ridge, supposedly to check my mail at the community mailbox station. But really, I wanted to see. It was spectacular. Linda's house, along with 5 others, had massive snow drifts piled against the garage doors and first-floor windows. These weren't the usual drifts you get from a storm. These were mountains of snow, compressed and packed by the wind into solid walls of white that completely blocked access to the properties. Linda was outside with 3 other women, all of them standing next to a massive drift that had to be 12 feet tall. She was on her phone, clearly furious, gesturing wildly. I pulled up to the mailboxes and got out, making a show of checking my mail. Linda spotted me and marched over, her boots crunching through the crusty snow. "Did you do this?" she demanded. "Do what? Make it snow? Don't be smart with me. These drifts are your fault somehow." I looked at the massive wall of snow behind her. "Linda, I'm not God. I can't control the weather or the wind. This never happened before, not like this. Maybe it's because of climate change. I hear wind patterns are shifting." I closed my mailbox and headed back to my truck. "Good luck with the cleanup. Looks like you'll need it." I drove away while she stood there, literally shaking with rage, and I felt absolutely no guilt whatsoever. The pattern repeated itself over the next month. Every time we got a significant snowfall with wind, I'd carefully blade my property to create that ramp effect, and every time, the ridge properties would get hammered with massive drifts. My property got snow, sure, but nothing like what they were experiencing. Linda tried everything. She hired a meteorologist to study the wind patterns. She called the county to see if I was violating some ordinance. She even tried to get the fire department to declare it a safety hazard. Nothing worked because I wasn't actually doing anything illegal. I was just clearing snow on my own property in a particular way. By mid-December, the situation on the ridge was getting serious. The drifts were so large and so frequent that the professional snow removal companies were charging premium rates to clear them. I heard through Tom that Linda was paying almost $2,000 after each major storm just to get her garage accessible. The HOA called an emergency meeting 2 days before Christmas. I didn't attend, but Tom filled me in on the details later. Linda tried to pass a special assessment to pay for industrial snow removal equipment for the community. He told me over beers at the Orr House in town. $5,000 per property. Let me guess, it didn't pass. Not even close. People are already paying a fortune to clear their own properties. Nobody wanted to pay more for communal equipment. Tom took a sip of his beer. But here's the interesting part. Someone, I think it was Jeff Henderson, suggested that maybe the snow fence wasn't such a bad idea after all. What did Linda say? She nearly had a stroke. Said over her dead body would she allow that eyesore in the community. Then Jeff pointed out that the snow fences would help everyone, not just you. If you caught the drifting snow on your property, it wouldn't continue up to the ridge. Bet she loved that logic. She shut down the discussion and ended the meeting. But Harrison, people are starting to talk. They're starting to figure out that you were trying to solve a problem and the HOA stopped you. That was gratifying to hear, but it didn't change my situation. I still couldn't put up a snow fence without HOA approval, and Linda would never give it. Then January arrived with a vengeance. The National Weather Service started tracking a massive storm system moving in from the Pacific. The forecasters were calling it a potential historic event, with predictions of 30 to 40 inches of snow and sustained winds of 40 miles per hour. Durango declared a snow emergency, and the local news was telling people to stock up on supplies and prepare to be snowed in for several days. I spent 2 days getting ready. I stocked up on food, fuel for my generator, propane for my backup heat, and made sure I had everything I needed. I also spent some time with my tractor, building the biggest snow ramp I'd ever attempted along my eastern property line. The storm hit on January 7th, and it was everything they'd predicted. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see 20 feet in front of your face. The wind screamed like a demon, rattling windows and tearing at anything not secured. I stayed inside, watching through my windows as the world turned into a white void. It snowed for 3 days straight. Not continuously heavy, but it never really stopped, and the wind never quit. I'd lived through plenty of blizzards growing up in Montana, but this was something else. This was the kind of storm that people talked about for years afterward. When it finally ended on the morning of January 10th, the sun came out into a crystalline blue sky and revealed a transformed landscape. The field to my east was swept almost clean, just a few inches of snow covering the frozen ground. My property had drifts, but nothing I couldn't handle. The ridge was a different story. I grabbed my binoculars and looked up toward Linda's house. What I saw was almost hard to believe. The entire north-facing side of her house was buried under a snow drift that reached halfway up the second floor. Her garage was completely invisible. The Mercedes I'd seen parked in the driveway was now just a vague lump under 20 feet of snow. The other houses on that side of the ridge looked similar. The Hendersons' place had a drift that had completely covered their front entrance and was pressing against their windows. The Kramers' house looked like an igloo, with only the roof and parts of the second floor visible. My phone started ringing around noon. It was Tom. "You need to come up here. The fire department is evacuating people from the ridge." I drove up carefully, my truck in four-wheel drive, following the single lane that the county plow had managed to clear. When I got to the ridge, it was chaos. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles were parked along the main road. Firefighters in full gear were working to dig out the buried houses, trying to reach people who were trapped inside. I spotted Linda standing next to an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, looking completely shell-shocked. I parked and walked over to where Tom was standing with a group of other residents. "Is everyone okay?" I asked. "Physically, yeah. But 6 houses up here are essentially buried. The fire chief is worried about roof collapse from the weight of the snow. They're evacuating everyone until structural engineers can assess the damage." I watched as firefighters worked to dig out a second-story window on the Kramers' house. The scale of the drifts was incredible. These weren't just piles of snow. They were solid walls of wind-packed powder that might as well have been concrete. Linda spotted me and came storming over. Even wrapped in an emergency blanket and clearly having just been evacuated from her house, she managed to look furious. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You did this. I made it snow 40 inches. You manipulated the snow patterns. You created those ramps on your property specifically to send the drifts up here." A sheriff's deputy who was coordinating with the fire department overheard and walked over. "Madam, is there a problem?" Linda pointed at me. "This man deliberately caused property damage to multiple homes. I want him arrested." The deputy, a young guy who looked like he'd been up for 36 hours straight, sighed. "Madam, did this man cause the snowstorm?" "No, but he manipulated snow on his property to damage ours. By clearing snow from his own land. Yes, he created ramps that sent the snow up here." The deputy looked at me. "Sir, did you clear snow from your property?" "Yes, officer, I have to keep my driveway accessible." "And you cleared it in a way that sent snow toward these houses." "I cleared it in a way that was efficient and worked with the natural wind patterns. I can't control where the wind takes snow after it leaves my property." The deputy nodded slowly. "Madam, I don't think there's a crime here. People are allowed to clear snow from their property however they want, as long as they're not putting it on public roads or someone else's property." But he knew what would happen. Linda was practically screaming now. Knowing that wind might blow snow in a certain direction isn't a crime. "I'm sorry about your house, but I can't arrest someone for clearing their driveway." He turned back to me. "Sir, I'd recommend you head home. This area is restricted to emergency personnel and residents only right now." I nodded and walked back to my truck. Behind me, I could hear Linda still arguing with the deputy, her voice getting more shrill with each passing second. Over the next week, the full extent of the damage became clear. 3 of the 6 buried houses had suffered roof damage from the weight of the snow. Linda's house had a collapsed section of roof over her garage that would cost $60,000 to repair. The Hendersons had water damage throughout their first floor from snow that had been packed against their windows and melted its way inside. The total damage across all 6 properties was estimated at over $300,000. The HOA held another emergency meeting on January 18th. This time, I made sure to attend. Linda's living room was packed with angry homeowners. The people from the buried houses were furious about the damage. The people from the unaffected houses were furious about a proposed special assessment to cover the repairs. Everyone was talking at once, and Linda looked like she hadn't slept in days. She finally banged a gavel on her coffee table hard enough to crack it. "Order! We need order!" The room quieted down. Linda shuffled some papers, clearly trying to regain some authority. "As you all know, we've experienced unprecedented snow damage to multiple properties. After consultation with our insurance company and legal counsel, I'm proposing a special assessment of $15,000 per property to cover the damage that insurance won't pay for." The room exploded again. People were shouting, some standing up, others waving their hands for attention. A man I recognized as Jeff Henderson stood up and his voice cut through the chaos. "This is insane. My house wasn't even damaged. Why should I pay for repairs to houses that were built in a known drift zone? Because we're a community," Linda snapped. "We share the burden." "No." Jeff shook his head. "We share the burden of common area maintenance. We don't share the burden of poor planning and worse decision-making." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means Harrison Kimball tried to tell us this would happen. He tried to install snow control measures on his property, and you shut him down. You prioritized aesthetics over functionality, and now we're all supposed to pay for that mistake." Other people started agreeing, nodding their heads, adding their own complaints about Linda's management style. I stayed quiet, just watching the drama unfold. Linda's face was scarlet. "Mr. Kimball's snow fence would have been an eyesore that damaged our property values." "You know what damages property values?" Jeff shot back. "Houses buried under 20 feet of snow, collapsed roofs, emergency evacuations. That's what damages property values." A woman I didn't know stood up. "I move that we vote to allow snow fence installations for any property owner who wants one, effective immediately." "Second," someone else called out. Linda tried to shut down the motion, but the room was against her now. After 15 minutes of procedural arguments and escalating tensions, they finally took a vote, 43-5 in favor. Snow fences were now allowed in Pinecrest Highlands. Linda looked like she'd been physically struck. Her carefully constructed kingdom of rules and regulations was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do about it. But she wasn't done yet. As people started filing out of the meeting, she pointed at me. "This isn't over, Kimball. You deliberately caused damage to multiple properties. You'll be hearing from my attorney." I met her glare with a calm smile. "Looking forward to it." 3 days later, I received a letter from Linda's personal attorney, not the HOA's lawyer. She was suing me personally for $200,000 in damages, claiming I had intentionally created conditions that destroyed her property. I took the letter to Steve Morrison, my property attorney. "Can she win this?" I asked. Steve read through the complaint carefully. "She's going to have a hard time. You didn't violate any laws or ordinances. You cleared snow from your own property. The fact that wind then carried that snow toward her house doesn't make you liable for where it ended up. So I should fight it, absolutely. And Harrison, I think you might have a counterclaim here." "For what?" "The HOA, under Linda's direction, prevented you from installing a snow control measure that would have solved this problem. You could argue that their obstruction actually caused the damage to their own properties. Plus, if we can prove she's using HOA resources or authority for personal litigation, that's a breach of fiduciary duty." I liked the sound of that. Let's do it. The legal battle dragged on for months. Linda was absolutely convinced she could prove I'd intentionally damaged her property, and she was willing to spend a fortune trying. She hired an engineering firm to analyze the wind patterns, brought in experts on snow drift formation, and even commissioned a computer model showing how snow moved across the landscape. The problem was, all of her evidence actually supported my defense. Yes, the way I cleared snow created conditions that directed drifts toward the ridge. But I was only doing that because the HOA had prevented me from installing a proper snow fence. Every expert she brought in confirmed that a snow fence on my property would have solved the entire problem. My countersuit focused on the HOA's obstruction. Steve subpoenaed all of Linda's emails and HOA records, and what we found was damning. Linda had emails dating back to before I'd even installed my first snow fence, discussing how she needed to maintain control over the community's appearance. She'd instructed the architectural committee to deny my snow fence specifically, because approving it might set a precedent for other utilitarian structures. In other words, she'd prioritized her personal aesthetic preferences over the practical needs of community members, and that decision had directly led to the damage her house suffered. The case went to mediation in June. Linda showed up with her attorney, looking confident. I showed up with Steve and a box full of documents. The mediator, a retired judge named Patricia Vollmer, spent the morning reviewing both cases. After lunch, she called us back into the conference room. "Mrs. Pemberton, I'm going to be frank with you. Your case has significant problems." Mr. Kimball was engaged in lawful activity on his own property. You can't prove intentional damage because he was simply clearing snow in an efficient manner. Moreover, Mr. Kimball's countersuit raises serious questions about whether the HOA's denial of his snow fence request constituted negligence or even harassment. Linda's attorney started to object, but Judge Vollmer held up her hand. "I'm not finished. I've reviewed the emails and documents Mr. Kimball's attorney provided. Mrs. Pemberton, you explicitly stated in writing that you wanted to deny the snow fence to maintain control and set a precedent. That's not a legitimate basis for denying a functional structure, especially when that structure would have prevented the exact damage you're now claiming Mr. Kimball caused. But the community standards," Linda started, "are subject to reasonableness requirements under Colorado HOA law. An HOA cannot arbitrarily deny reasonable requests that serve legitimate purposes. Mr. Kimball's snow fence served a legitimate purpose, and you denied it for aesthetic reasons while knowing he had a serious snow drift problem." The mediation session lasted another 3 hours. In the end, Linda agreed to drop her lawsuit against me. In exchange, I agreed to drop my countersuit against her personally, though I reserved the right to pursue action against the HOA if they interfered with any future snow control measures. But the real victory came 2 weeks later, at the annual HOA meeting and board election. Tom had been organizing behind the scenes, talking to residents who were fed up with Linda's management style. The special assessment proposal had failed, meaning the people whose houses were damaged had to pay for repairs out of pocket. Linda had tried to blame me for that, but most people saw through it now. They understood that her stubbornness and control issues had created the problem in the first place. When nominations opened for the board presidency, 3 people immediately nominated Jeff Henderson. Jeff accepted and gave a short speech about bringing common sense back to the HOA, focusing on practical concerns rather than arbitrary rules. Linda, of course, nominated herself. She gave a 20-minute speech about maintaining property values and community standards, about not letting outsiders destroy the vision of Pinecrest Highlands. The vote wasn't even close. Jeff won with 41 votes to Linda's 12. Linda stood up, her face white with shock and rage. "This is a mistake. You're all making a terrible mistake. The only mistake was electing you in the first place," someone called out from the back. Linda grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. It was the last HOA meeting she ever attended. That summer, I installed a new snow fence along my eastern property line. This time, I made it nice. I used cedar posts and horizontal slats, stained a natural color that blended with the landscape. It looked more like a decorative fence than a utilitarian structure, but it would do the same job. Jeff Henderson stopped by while I was finishing the installation. "Looks good," he said. "Very tasteful. Thanks. Learned my lesson about working with the HOA instead of against it. Speaking of which, the new board has been reviewing the CC and Articus. We're proposing some amendments to make them more reasonable. Fewer arbitrary restrictions, more focus on actual problems like property maintenance and noise issues." Sounds like a good plan. Linda's selling her house, by the way, put it on the market last week. That didn't surprise me. After her very public humiliation and the expensive roof repairs, Pinecrest Highlands probably didn't hold much appeal anymore. Where's she going? Somewhere in Arizona, I heard. Probably going to find another HOA to tyrannize. We both laughed at that, though I felt a little bad for whoever ended up in Linda's next community. The following winter was completely different from the previous ones. When the first major storm hit in November, my snow fence did exactly what it was supposed to do. The drifts dropped along my property line, well short of my driveway and house. I spent maybe 30 minutes clearing a few inches of snow, compared to the hours I'd wasted before. More importantly, the houses on the ridge barely got any drifts at all. With my fence catching the blowing snow, there was nothing left to continue up the hill. Jeff called me after that first storm to thank me, said his driveway was clearer than it had been in years. 3 other property owners on the eastern edge of Pinecrest installed their own snow fences that winter, following my design. Tom put one up in December and sent me a photo of his clear driveway with the message, "Life-changing." I ran into Linda one more time before she moved. It was mid-March, and I was in Durango picking up supplies. She was coming out of a coffee shop, and we nearly walked into each other. "Linda," I said, nodding. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not angry anymore, but not friendly either. More like resignation mixed with lingering resentment. "I hope you're happy," she said quietly. "I'm content. I solved a problem that was making my life difficult. You destroyed everything I built in that community." I shook my head. "You destroyed it yourself, Linda. You could have worked with me. You could have found a compromise. Instead, you made it a battle about control, and you lost." She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For a moment, I saw something that might have been understanding cross her face, but it was gone too quickly to be sure. "Goodbye, Harrison. Goodbye, Linda." I watched her walk to her Mercedes and drive away. Part of me wondered if she'd learned anything from the experience, if maybe she'd approach her next community with a little more flexibility and a little less need for absolute authority. But I doubted it. Some people never change. As for me, I went back to my life in Pinecrest Highlands, which was finally starting to feel like the home I'd envisioned when I first bought the property. My workshop was producing some of my best work, and I'd taken on an apprentice, a young woman from Durango who was eager to learn metalworking. I had good neighbors now, people who appreciated practical solutions over arbitrary rules. The snow fence stood along my property line, weathering gray in the mountain sun, doing its job without complaint. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the battle it had taken to install it, and the lesson I'd learned about picking your fights carefully. But I also remembered the satisfaction of standing my ground when I was right, and the sweet justice of watching someone who'd abused their authority finally face consequences for their actions. That spring, Jeff Henderson and the new HOA board passed a resolution that any functional structure serving a legitimate purpose would be approved unless there was a compelling reason to deny it. They also established a process for appealing architectural committee decisions and limited the board president's authority to act unilaterally. Pinecrest Highlands didn't become a lawless free-for-all. People still had to maintain their properties and follow reasonable guidelines. But the culture changed from one of arbitrary control to one of practical cooperation. And that made all the difference. I still live there today, 5 years after that first winter battle with Linda Pemberton. My house is paid off, my business is thriving, and every winter, my snow fence does exactly what it's supposed to do. The drifts drop harmlessly along my property line, my driveway stays clear, and the houses on the ridge remain accessible and undamaged. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling down from the mountains, I stand at my window and watch the snow devils dance across the field. I think about that winter when I watched massive drifts bury million-dollar homes, when I stood by and let nature take its course because a petty tyrant had decided her aesthetic preferences were more important than my practical needs. I don't regret it. I tried to solve the problem the right way first, through proper channels and reasonable requests. Linda Pemberton made the choice to turn it into a war, and wars have casualties. In this case, the casualties were 6 damaged houses and 1 destroyed reputation. The snow fence stands as a monument to that battle, a simple structure of cedar and common sense that proved more powerful than all of Linda's rules and regulations. It's a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just letting natural consequences play out while you protect yourself. And on those cold winter nights, when the wind is really screaming and the snow is flying horizontal across the landscape, I sleep soundly in my warm house, knowing that come morning, my driveway will be clear and my property will be accessible. Because I installed a simple snow fence, and because I was willing to fight for my right to do so. That's the thing about living in the mountains. Nature doesn't care about your HOA rules or your aesthetic preferences. Nature does what nature does, and the smart people work with it instead of against it. Linda Pemberton learned that lesson the hard way, buried under 20 feet of snow in a house that should have been protected by the very fence she'd forbidden me to build. I learned it too, but my lesson was different. I learned that sometimes you have to let people make their own mistakes, even when you know exactly how those mistakes will play out. I learned that you can't save people from themselves, especially when they're determined to exercise power they shouldn't have. Most importantly, I learned that standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult and expensive and frustrating, is worth it in the end. Because that snow fence isn't just a functional structure. It's a symbol of my right to make reasonable decisions about my own property, free from the arbitrary control of someone who valued appearances over reality. These days, when new people move into Pinecrest Highlands, they often ask about the snow fences along the eastern edge of the development. The real estate agents tell them it's a practical feature that protects against winter drifting. The longtime residents tell them the story of Linda Pemberton and the HOA war that changed the community. And me. If someone asks me directly, I tell them the simple truth. I tried to install a snow fence to solve a real problem. The HOA, led by a woman who cared more about control than common sense, banned it. So I cleared my property in a way that was perfectly legal but had predictable consequences for the people who'd prevented me from installing proper snow control measures. I watched massive drifts bury their million-dollar homes, and I didn't lift a finger to help them until they changed their minds and let me install my fence. Not because I'm vindictive, but because sometimes people need to experience the full consequences of their decisions before they're willing to admit they were wrong. The snow fence still stands, weathered but strong, doing its job year after year. And every winter, when the first big storm rolls in from the mountains, I look at that simple cedar structure and smile, because it represents something more than just snow control. It represents the victory of common sense over arbitrary authority, of practical solutions over aesthetic obsessions, of individual rights over collective control. Linda Pemberton tried to use the HOA to force me to live according to her vision of what the community should be. Instead, she ended up buried under the consequences of her own stubbornness, and she lost everything she'd worked to build. Her house, her reputation, her position of authority, all of it gone because she couldn't accept that sometimes function has to come before form. As for me, I'm still here, still working in my workshop, still enjoying my mountain views, and still watching my snow fence do its job every winter. The drifts drop where they're supposed to, my property stays accessible, and the community has learned to value practical solutions over arbitrary rules. That's the real ending to this story. Not revenge, not vindication, just a simple snow fence standing against the wind, protecting what matters and letting nature take its course everywhere else. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.